And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. Our guest today is Cristina Borges. Her book is Of Bells and Cells, published by St. Bonosa Books and illustrated by Michaela Harrison. Great to see you, Cristina.
Thank you for having me here.
And people would not recognize you that often. They might have seen you translating on certain shows, etc. over the years. You were here with Father Philippe on a show earlier, a bookmark we did as well. But you've actually been associated with EWTN going back, what, to 1996?
1996. I was hired to work in the marketing department at that point. We had just launched internationally, and they needed somebody with some international experience, so I was hired for that.
Right.
And I moved from Chicago to Birmingham and worked for many years for the network.
Right, for almost 10 years then,
yes.
Before you, okay. And now you've been off doing other projects and things. In fact, we had that adventure in England and the UK with Marcus, myself, and you. Jason Addington, tooling around there, doing multiple programs and journey homes all through. It was very
It was
exciting,
one of our first efforts to bring local content to some of the mainstays of EWTN. You know, the major programs done locally. Right. So that was our goal. My involvement was in Europe, so that's right.
And you're still involved with our foundation right over in the UK, right?
Now I'm involved on a part-time basis with Great Britain, St. Clair Media in Great Britain, helping out. So I'm really overjoyed. It's a privilege to be back in the apostolate. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, let's talk about Bells and Cells, because if I understand right, this is something that you actually worked on years and years ago, right? So this you could say this book has taken, what, more than 15 years to
about 15 years to come about, because in fact it was right after I moved here to Birmingham to work for EWTN. I was having a conversation with a young lady. She was probably 14, 15. And in my conversation I mentioned Carmelites, and I could see, I forget what the context was, but I could see that Carmelites, she drew a blank. She didn't know what it was. So I said, Carmelites, you know, nuns, still had the blank, you know, and she was a Catholic, you know, practicing Catholic. And I thought to myself, you know, the young people really don't know religious, not only that, they don't know the history, the impact that religious orders have had in history in the church, throughout its history, each one in their own charism. So I thought, I'm going to write a book about religious orders. So I sat down at the computer and okay, where do I start? And then I thought, I can't begin to describe the different charisms and histories of the different orders if people don't even know what a religious is. So let me first write a book about religious life, and that's how that came about. Right,
and you made this, what would you say, it's got beautiful illustrations, you know, it's got some young children kind of you're introduced to in the beginning here, and you kind of see how they you know, live their lives and the options that might be in their lives in the sense of whether God calls one to be married or remain single and serve him, or to be a religious or have some other vocation, of course. And one could be also what they call, what people see as what we call is actually a secular priest, but a diocesan priest, the kind of priest you'd see in your parish, who'd be wearing the black with the, you know, the Roman collar effect as well. One of the things I wanted to ask you, in the sense of, with the ages I see here pictured, what is the target audience, would you say, for this book?
That's a good question. Primarily young children, but I wrote it in a language that really should be for all. What I envision this book, I think a child from age 7 to 12 could pick up the book and read on his or her own, but I do envision it being read in a family context, particularly the appendix, which is a little bit more complicated language, but around that. And also, hopefully, you know, teenagers and even young adults wouldn't be bored by it, hopefully.
Right. Do you see this also the kind of book maybe a grandmother or somebody maybe who's watching the kids or something might want to give that as a gift for, you know, part of First Holy Communion or confirmation, or even for Christmas or birthday, or have something that actually is another thing they can kind of even read a little bit to kind of
read together,
inculcate that understanding of
yes, I envision grandmothers sitting with their grandchildren, reading through the book and looking at all the wonderful illustrations, because you know, after I wrote the text, I thought to myself, I wrote it in a very systematic way, you know, This is, you know, some people are called to religious life. This is how they go about becoming religious. They visit communities, they become postulants and novices. Then if the novice feels, and the community that has accepted that novice feels that yes, they can be permanently with that community, then there's the profession of vows, etc. Then I explain the vows. So it's very systematic, and I knew that I needed illustrations to kind of bring out the meaning, make it warm, and you know, I think the text is okay, but it needed that extra to bring everything
especially
together,
for children, I think it helps. The image reinforces the learning.
Absolutely, yes.
And kind of conveys some of what's in the text. You say, you talk about religious life, and you say, they also form big families of their own, religious families called religious orders, living together in community inside monasteries or convents under the care and guidance of a superior. I thought this was a nice way of putting it. Just as in a family, grandfather and grandmother pass on a name, looks, and ways to father and mother, then the father and mother pass on the name, looks, and ways to their children. So religious families pass on from one generation to the next a way of living, praying, and of thinking about God. That's a nice way of putting it.
Right, and that would be the charism of each order, which of course I don't quite get into in this book, but yes.
And the charism is what the central theme of their religious life is about? Right.
For example, well, part of the charism would be the history, and obviously the founder has a lot to do, everything to do with the charism.
And you talk about the founders.
Yes, for example, St. Francis of Assisi, who left everything and became the poverello, you know, the poor, so poverty was very important. Detachment from the things of this world is an essential element of the Franciscan order. The Carmelites, for example, that they trace their history back to Saint Elias, the prophet. You know, who there were other prophets living on Mount Carmel as hermits. So theirs was a contemplative life. What they did was the Essenes, they prayed for the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah. Later the Messiah came, so they continued praying for the coming, the spread of his kingdom. So the contemplative aspect or contemplative life is an essential aspect of Carmelite spirituality.
Who would be probably the most famous Carmelite that most people
Well, it's
know
hard to say
here?
the most famous because they're too big.
Too big.
You know, Saint Teresa of Avila, the reformer of the Carmelites, for establishing the Descalced Carmelites, and of course Saint Therese of Lisieux, whom we all know and love.
Right.
And of course, who I prayed very much, and I have Saint Therese in there. So when I speak about the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, for that we used saints to illustrate, and not only visually but also in writing. So of course St. Francis, St. Clare were used for the vows of poverty, and St. Therese and St. Aloysius Gonzaga for the vow of chastity. And then St. Benedict and St. Rita de Cascia for the vow of obedience, because they're two very interesting little stories on obedience connected with those two saints.
Right, and we had a movie on St. Rita that people hopefully learned about as well. Now, one of the things too, you talk about the whole idea of how one goes to join, with the idea of the first 6 months, a period of introduction. Why don't we just talk about how one goes when someone joins? Let's say like Mother's Order would be for the Poor Clares, and you talk about the Poor Clares in here as well, and of course Clare relates to St. Clare and Franciscans, just like our friars here. So when one comes in, how does that work?
Okay, so first a young person or older person will, sometimes they visit different communities, sometimes they already feel very called to that particular community. So they are, perhaps some communities, convents or monasteries accept visitors, they stay for a little while, then they decide to join. So they come, when they come in, they come as postulants. You know, they won't be wearing the habit, they're just there for, usually, it depends on the order, but usually from 6 months to maybe a year, they're postulants. And it's a time of becoming acquainted. So the postulant becomes acquainted with that particular community, their charism, their schedule, their rule, and the community in turn becomes acquainted with that particular person. After those 6 months or that period of postulancy, if they see that they can be together, there's a synergy there, it works, so then the postulant will become accepted as a novice. And then you have the novitiate. So during that period, when a postulant becomes a novice, they become a religious at that point. Before they were still lay.
And that's when they would be vested in some way. They would wear some more outward sign.
They receive the habit.
Okay.
So they receive quite often, depending again on the order, they receive a name, a new name, such as the Franciscans here do. Sometimes it's just the first name that is changed. Sometimes it becomes a name and a title, like, you know, Teresa of Christ the King, Sister Teresa of Christ the King. So they receive a new name and they receive the habit. So the habit is that external sign of their commitment to God in this way of life, you know, the religious life. It's a witness to the world that they have chosen this path, you know, and of course that they belong to that particular religious order, because each order has its own habit.
Right. Well, you say outwardly, because the habit was something, you know, in the last 40 years, you know, we've gone in somewhat different directions. It seems to be that it's clearly coming back, at least with the orders that are growing. Certainly, Mother went even from the kind of reformed habit to the more traditional habit back in the 90s, I guess, after kind of World Youth Days. You say outwardly the habit inspires respect because people will know that that person wearing a habit is a religious. People will normally be inspired to behave well before a monk or a nun. It's interesting because for a while that was saying, well, you know, you're wearing it and it keeps you separate from the people, or it makes you look like you're too proud.
Not at all. Quite the contrary. You know, well, you can have two different reactions. Right. Obviously, you can have a negative reaction. I remember one Carmelite friar told me he was studying in Rome and he was actually spat at as he was going by. Somebody spit at him from the window. So that was, you know, that's the contempt from the world, and that's, again, the cross that you offer up to God. God told us, you know, that we would be persecuted and so forth. But there are those, of course, most of the time it'll be very positive reaction, because as a habit will mean that this person is dedicated to God, has a life of prayer, and probably has a deep understanding of our innermost needs and spiritual needs. So it could almost be an opening for a person to approach. You know, if I'm a lay person, I see somebody in a habit, I might feel inclined to approach this person and ask for advice or ask for prayer.
And we hear those stories all the time from certainly our priests, and that if they're wearing their collar or they're in their habit, how many people will, on a plane or in an airport or someplace else, start up a conversation.
I heard exactly that story at an airport. A gentleman saw a priest, in fact, a priest in cassock, and he came up to him. The priest told me this story, and he said he had been away for 30 years from the church, and he asked the priest, to hear his confession. He would have never done that if the priest weren't wearing the right garb. You know, that indicates that he is a priest. I also found, for me, I always felt like, I remember walking in New York City years ago and seeing a sister in habit, and it stopped me because you didn't see that many but it kind of put me back in the idea, that's right, this isn't all there is. This is a sign of what is to come. You know what I mean? And you talk about that kind of in the book as well, that idea of how they mirror, you know, where we don't get married, where there's no marriage in heaven, etc., that these people are a sign in a sense of what the future actually holds. Right, and in fact, it's interesting you mentioned that in New York City, because I remember the story of Rosalind Moss, now Mother Miriam of the Lamb of God, I believe. She said, you know, as a secular Jewish business lady in New York City in the 60s, when, you know, she read something in the news that, you know, now things were changing and sisters weren't going to wear the habit all the time, and she, as a Jewish person, felt deprived from a richness and a wealth, you know, even subconsciously. So that shows one more example of what a beautiful sign the habit is. Well,
you said this was just very practical. When monks, nuns, friars, and sisters wake up in the morning, they take no time deciding what to wear that day, since it's always the habit or order. So this is one less little instance of thinking of yourself. Of being, because you're really conforming in this way, right? You're not trying to stand out and be an individual. You're not sitting there focused on yourself.
Yes, that's an interesting thought, because, you know, in the book I say, well, there's the habit helps you outwardly, but it also helps with your inward life, that being one little aspect, you know, one less instance of thinking of self, because you wake up, you don't have to worry about what you're going to wear. It's already chosen for you by by God in a certain way.
Right. Now we talk about you use the word promises that religious make that are also called vows, but there are also actually a distinction, right, in the church between certain secular priests make promises versus vows. There's some differences.
Right,
in that.
And you know, I had to think long about that because it's not that cut and dry.
Right.
You know, even for example, the Benedictines the Benedictines built Western society. They were founded by St. Benedict in the 5th century, you know, so they're an order of antiquity. And they don't say but they don't have the 3 vows. They have a vow of obedience and of stability. But of course, under obedience comes the chastity part and the poverty part, because their rule requires chastity and poverty. You know, they own nothing, and that's in St. Benedict's rule. So I had to discern what I'm going to do. Well, you know, let's see, the most common type of vows that there are, and throughout all the orders, are those 3. You know, the poverty, chastity, and obedience. So that's what I went for. But you're right, and a diocesan priest does not make the religious vows. So this really is a book about religious life.
Right.
And that's why we talk about the vows.
Right, exactly. Okay. Yeah, because one of the things I wasn't aware of when I went, I guess, until later in life, realizing that a diocesan priest does not take a vow of poverty. And so the fact that a priest may have a family that left them property or land and things like that. I also wasn't always aware that many times they're responsible for taking care of themselves later in life too, more so than I think most of us Catholics thought. We just kind of assumed, you know, there must be the old retirement home for the priests, or don't they kind of just live in the rectory, you know, kind of a thing. So.
Right, and yeah, that's a totally different situation from the religious life. And that is why at the very end, when I finish the text on religious life, I felt I needed to say a little bit about the priesthood, because it can be confusing. You know, there are priests who are religious, you know, religious orders like the Benedictines, the Dominicans. Men in these orders can be priests, but they don't have to be priests. If they're called to the priesthood, they're priests, but many are not, and they're brothers. So, but on the other hand, not every priest is a religious. You have the diocesan priest. So I thought I had to clarify that. So I do have a section just on the priesthood to explain that.
Right. You say here, what they do is not as important as what they are.
Right.
What do you mean?
So, well, that's prefaced by a question. So, you know, throughout the book, we're explaining, you know, what is the religious life, what it is all about.
And what do religious do?
But, okay, so they have the vows. So what? You know, what do they do? Well, that's not the point. The point is not what they do, is what they are. If they are growing in holiness, which is the goal of all our lives, you know, to become saints, and therefore doing the will of God, that's what matters, you know. And so if you are seeking to do the will of God, if you are seeking to grow in holiness and, you know, and receiving the grace of God to perform His will, what that will is, you know, what you're going to be doing is not as important. But then I take that section, what I do is I explain then there are the active, what they do is not as important as what they are. They have to be holy. But then, yes, there are religious orders dedicated solely to prayer, such as the contemplative, so they help the world with their own prayers and sacrifices, which is something very hidden, and we cannot begin to gauge how essential and important that is for society.
Right. Like our sisters in Eucharistic adoration.
Exactly.
Right.
But you also have what are called the active orders, such as the Missionaries of Charity of Mother Teresa. You have the Little Sisters of the Poor who take care of the elderly. So, you know, all this charitable work, external charitable work done by the active orders, or the teaching orders, you know, like the...
Right in the very beginning, when you have the 2 children, there's an illustration of them coming into like a little town and with like different ways, I guess, pathways for them to follow. But one says convent and one says monastery. And sometimes, especially when it comes to sisters, there can be confusion as to what's the difference between like a monastery and a convent. Right.
And that is can be very confusing. And I did not touch on that at all. In fact, I should say that, you know, the illustrator, Michaela Harrison, who is a lovely young lady,
Very nice
she did
illustrations.
a beautiful job, and she went way beyond what I ever expected. As I was telling you, I knew I needed illustrations, and I had in mind very specific themes for the illustrations. So I asked her, you know, for example, this one here, I asked her, you know, this is what I would like, you know, show this as the family or the teacher, the single teacher, or the religious.
Right.
But she went beyond that, and she added this other portion there that shows little two children being confronted with the choice, you know, are they going to be lay or are they going to be religious? And she put that there, a monastery and a convent. Many things in the book are a little bit mysterious and will remain mysterious maybe till we have a second episode to this. But the difference between a monastery and convent really depends on not so much whether these are men religious or women religious, but what order they belong to. So for example, contemplative religious will live in, their home, let's say, are called monasteries.
Right.
So the Benedictines.
Like the mothers in Hanceville.
Exactly, like the Poor Clares of Adoration or of Perpetual Adoration, or the Carmelites. Then active, for example, believe it or not, but Franciscan friars normally, you can say convent, you know, the Franciscan friars live in a convent, or Dominicans who are considered friars also live in convents. So. But then it gets a little bit complicated.
You never think about that because, you know, always as kids, I guess you grew up when you went to school in the 60s. You know, that's where the sisters who taught you, that's where they lived. They lived in the convent.
In the convent.
You'd have to help sister bring her bag over to the convent, you know.
So most of the time, active orders will be living in convents.
Right. And that's where you also get into the use of the word sister versus nun. I mean, a lot of times we'll call the nuns our sisters or refer to them as sisters. But is it my understanding? So is the active usually a sister, and then the contemplative would be called a nun, basically?
You're correct. Absolutely, yes. And a monk.
So I read your book. That's why I know.
So a monk is the contemplative, you know, or at least belongs to a contemplative order, like the Benedictine, traditionally contemplative, like the Benedictines or the Carthusians. These would be called monks. And the active orders, such as, let's say, the Franciscans, and again, you have to go back to their history. The Franciscans started with St. Francis leaving the world, but they were very much into preaching through their example, but also preaching in the streets. Right. The Dominicans, that's their charism, is to preach, to bring light to people who might be in error. So this,
and that's
this
why
is
we
active.
see orders like the Mother Sumter's order, obviously, that deals with education. Certainly, the Nashville Dominican sisters, who are all about education.
And the Franciscans, the Dominicans, are friars.
And you can usually tell the Dominicans because they wear white habits.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, in the appendix, I explain a little bit further on each order. I don't really get into orders in the body of the book, except for the illustrations that have the different habits. When we're talking about the habits, you say, you know, they're different. Different habits indicate what family or religious order this person belongs to. And you know, Michaela put the names of the orders there. So I said, well, we need to explain what these orders are. So there's an appendix for that.
To follow up, and if I believe, we can thank the Dominicans for why the Pope wears white, I think.
Yes,
basically,
exactly. St. Pius V, who was Pope and wore white.
So how did you decide, I mean, there are so many different orders inside the church and things like that, so how did you decide which ones to put in and not put in? The most popular, the ones you liked, or? Well,
I'm sure the ones I liked had something to do with it.
Okay.
But I went for the orders with more history to them. I don't have really new orders there, but I have, you know, the Benedictines, of course, and the Carmelites, Dominicans, Franciscans. And also one thing we try to do is keep a balance for girls and boys. So there's some orders that are only for women, some orders are only for men. For example, the Redemptorists are only for men, so I did have Redemptorists there. The Conceptionists are only for women, excuse me. And I have the Conception, that's interesting you ask, because I do have the Conceptionists in there.
Right, I saw them. Not even
and that is an order that
them,
is not present in any English-speaking country, I must say.
Okay.
But they have a very interesting history because it's connected to the evangelization of Latin America. They were the first nuns to come to these lands as contemplatives to pray for the Franciscan missionaries that were in Mexico. So they arrived in Mexico, I believe, I forget the exact date, it's somewhere around 1530. Yeah, but a couple of years before Our Lady appeared on Tepeyac, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And they were founded at the order of Our Lady herself. It's a long story. I recommend people get the book and read the story. It's a beautiful story. Or Google, you know, Conception is in English.
Well, I figure it's because she was founded by Saint Beatriz de Silva, who happens to be Portuguese.
Well, yes.
Is there any connection there, maybe? With,
well, yes, I have Brazilian background,
yeah, okay.
obviously. So that's, in fact, I discovered this order in Brazil, and I was fascinated. So they're mostly in Spain and all of Latin America, Brazil, and the Spanish-speaking countries in America. Very interesting order. So my hope is that this book will be translated to other languages, and I kind of had that in mind when it's translated.
You planning on doing some of the translation yourself?
Well, perhaps to Portuguese, yes.
Yeah, okay. And you've had this reviewed by other religious from each of the orders?
Definitely.
Sure
the religious I know, yes. I had Benedictines reading and Proclairs and Carmelites. For each of the orders in the appendix, I had a member of that order go through the text, so to make sure, because it has to be absolutely accurate.
Well, I don't know if it'll be another 15 years until you come with another book, but we appreciate you stopping by, Cristina, for this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Cristina. Good luck. M. Cristina Borges of Bells and Cells, St. Bonosa Books, illustrated by Michaela Harrison, and it's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on Bookmark.